All right, welcome everyone to our mental health and behavioral health webinar session. Today we're going to talk about leveraging MTSS to support student mental health. So on behalf of TEA, we're really glad that you took the time out of your day to join us today. So in today's session, we're going to learn about how to use your multi-tiered system of support to enhance the mental health of students. So this is going to include learning about how MTSS is used to support student mental health through implementing best practice strategies, utilizing data to inform decisions, and working with community partners. So today's session will be led by our colleagues at TIER, which is supported by TEA, Texas Fed Supports, the Meadows Center for Preventing Educational Risk, and the University of Texas at Austin. So our hope today is that you can take something away from our session and use it in your school community. So this is being recorded, and the recording and the supporting resources for this webinar will be posted on our website at the schoolmentalhealthtx.org/webinars, and that link will be put in the chat for you. And it will be posted. Give us about a week or so to get everything rendered and up and ready. All right, so I want to give you a reminder. As we start today, before we conclude our session, we're going to ask you to complete a post survey. So part of our mental health work here at TEA is funded by Project Aware Texas through the Federal Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA. Our grant requires a brief post survey for our training sessions with stakeholders. So we really appreciate your support with this requirement. All right, so let's a few other little housekeeping things is today's session is in Zoom webinar format, which means participants can't show their video or share their audio. So to ask questions, please use the Q&A function, and we're going to do our best to get them answered. If by chance you use the raise the hand function, we won't be able to assist you in that if you could just put your questions in the Q&A function. We also want you to become familiar with our chat function. So we're going to be adding resource links and stuff like that in the chat for you as we get started and then throughout our time together. So our last piece of housekeeping is a reminder that we will provide 1.5 CPE credits to educators for today's webinar to those attending the whole session. So a CPE certificate will be sent within about a week to the email address that you registered with, and this is the only way to get the certificate. We will not provide a CPE from TEA for the recordings. I will say in the past, those that have not received their certificates have found them in the spam or the junk folder. So please check that if you are missing your certificate. All right, so on with that. Ashton, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All righty. Thank you, Tammy. I'm super excited for our learning experience today. I know the folks over here at TIER are really awesome at what they do and very knowledgeable. What I'm going to do is just remind us really quickly about our Texas School Mental Health Framework. Our TIER team, they'll touch on this during our time together, but I do want to make sure and just give a reminder to everybody that the strategies and best practices that'll be showcased throughout this session, they all go into implementing this Texas School Mental Health Framework. And just to kind of walk us through that really quickly. So if we look at the schoolhouse, that is our multi-tiered system of support, right? Which is our approach to planning school mental health services and supports. And then as we look at the steps in the STONE pathway, those all identify the key domains and practices for establishing a quality school mental health system. And then finally, as we look up above the schoolhouse towards the clouds, that's where you'll see the components or the areas of school mental health, which is established by our Texas Education Code 38.351. And that in particular requires LEAs to address each area by developing practices, procedures, and professional development opportunities. And we're super excited to have the TIER team here today to really showcase again all of the ways to really leverage a multi-tier system of support to really impact student mental health through school mental health as well. So without further ado, I will pass it over to Dr. Barrett and Dr. Kearney from the TIER team to take you all on this amazing learning journey that they have planned for you all.
All right. Thank you, Ashton and Tammy, for Getting us started. I'm going to share screen, but I'm going to let Dr. Kearney introduce herself first, and then we'll get rolling.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Lakeisha Kearney, Dr. Kearney. I'm excited to join you from the TIER team today. Some of you might know me already from the state of Texas. I am a school psychologist, LSSP. I've worked in a couple districts here in Texas. Most recently, I'm coming from good old Region 4. So, hi to all my ESC 4 friends. Good to see you in the chat today. And also to my other uh, HISD friends and Humble ISD friends and all of the great friends in the Houston area. I'm happy to be with you today, sharing all of the mental health and MTSS resources with you today. So sit back. Strap in and share all the wealth of information that we have with you for today.
Yes, thank you. So happy, Lakeisha and I have been working together just a short time, but man, it's been really great, and I'm looking forward to more collaboration. And that's a lot of what this is, this tier project, and with TEA, it's collaboration. So excited to see some familiar names in the chat too. So I'm David Barrett. A little bit about me. So I've worked in education and mental health fields for 30 years now. 22 of those have been in the public education realm. I have a master's degree in counseling. I have a doctorate degree in education leadership. And before my time here at UT, I worked in Mesquite ISD. I was a special education teacher at Berry Middle School, and then I became a school counselor at Agnew Middle School. And I was also a principal for the extended school year and structured summer programs there. And so um, I'm excited about this work, passionate about this work. Personally, I'm married to a former teacher and school counselor who has her own private practice now. We have a 7-year-old who's in first grade, so it's also really fun to see the world through his eyes and exciting to explain things as they come up. So we'll kind of dive in here to this content. A lot of our tier trainings, all of our tier trainings have been developed in collaboration with ESC staff, with school districts across the state, with experts across the country. And so again, it's really a collaborative effort, and it's really about getting a conversation and working together. Our biggest goal here right now is to advance student mental health supports in schools through an integrated multi-tiered system of supports. That is something that we are passionate about. And I'm going to talk about the objectives, but before I do, I want to kind of get a little poll. And as we start talking about MTSS, multi-tier systems of supports, just want to see what's your level of knowledge when you feel like, is it you're like, MTSS, what's that? What'd you say? Or you're like, oh yeah, MTSS, I know it, I got it. Just kind of give us a little feel for where you're at. All right, it's kind of cool to watch this in real time. Looks like about 2/3 of us are somewhere in the middle, 3 or 4, decent knowledge about it. A few folks still maybe still pretty new to them. So thanks for sharing that. Hopefully, after today, you'll have a more knowledge of MTSS, and especially where MTSS fits when it comes to supporting student mental health. So we have just a short time together today, 90 minutes total. This is a huge topic, but I really do hope that in this time, we can introduce some key components, share some tools, give you some resources, guidance, really kind of spark that interest for you to learn more and get you connected where you can get more support and learn more. And we hope that by the end of this session, you can define a multi-tiered system of supports if you don't know that definition yet. You can understand how this MTSS can be leveraged to support student mental health. You can describe actionable best practices for how teams can effectively use data to drive decisions. You can identify data points at the systems level and student level that schools and districts can use to assess their school mental health system. And you can determine best practice strategies that can be implemented within an MTSS to address student needs. So we'll move on here. And I do want to apologize about my voice. With the way the Longhorns and the Cowboys have been playing lately, I've been yelling at the TV a lot. So I've got some hot tea that will hopefully help you help me hear me better. So let's look at what this question. What are comprehensive school mental health systems? So we have a definition here of comprehensive school mental health systems, and they're really designed to provide this continuum of services and supports. The goal is to promote positive school climate, teach and support skills for social, emotional, behavioral health, prevent mental health and substance use problems, intervene early to reduce the severity of mental health concerns, and provide access to school-based and community-based interventions and supports to students and families. So here is a picture we saw earlier, and this is a really great visual graphic developed by TEA. And it can kind of help us visualize and plan how to implement a research-based process to deliver services and supports within this comprehensive school mental health system, right? So we have this path to quality school mental health systems. It leads to our steps. It leads to our MTSS system. We have essential elements up in the clouds, what we're striving for. And I do like, I like this graphic a lot. And one of the things I like is it is a journey. And one of the things we're going to be talking about today is the journey that you are in, that your school is in, that your district or charter are in. And we really kind of want to work and partner with you with that journey. So multi-tiered systems of support, when I was working as a special education teacher and a school counselor, I hadn't even heard the phrase MTSS. I'd heard RTI. I learned about PBIS. But those are all, and we'll talk a little bit more later, but those are all multi-tiered systems of support. And so it's the framework and it's kind of the backpack that provides, a structure that you can house and hold all the elements that you need for academics, behavior, mental health. And so our goal today is to really look at that mental health piece. And we'll start off with a story that a parent shared with us. It was actually a collaborator that helped us develop this content. And as she was helping us develop the content, she wanted to share her own story because this is what it's all about, right? It's about the people in our building. It's about their story, and it's about how school and the work we're doing is impacting them. So I'll read this to you here. You can read along. My daughter was attending a school where she was obtaining a great deal of special education services, but failing, skipping school, etc. I was advised that she should just drop out. I transferred her to a school using MTSS. On her first day, she told me that the teachers cared and that being in trouble was not cool. This was so strange to her that she wanted to leave. They showed her that it was okay to take risks and struggle, how to take pride in doing something she thought she could never do. They built close relationships with her. My relationship with her improved and behavior at home improved. She now is an honor student in college and stays connected with her high school teachers. I love this school. The folks there brought the amazing girl that I knew was hiding underneath back to life. So this was a Title I school that spent a lot of time and energy on training and mentoring the staff. And I just think it's a really powerful story that kind of shows us, how important sometimes these tedious things can be, but they're important, they're needed. They create that structure that we need to do that work, to build the relationships and work with these parents and students and caregivers. So speaking of the framework, here you have some bulleted lists to kind of help define what that MTSS framework is. It provides an integrated system to support students' academic, behavioral, and mental health needs. And I kind of want to pause on that. It's that integrated piece, right? Because what I don't want anyone to come away with is like, oh my gosh, one more thing. Dr. Barrett and Dr. Kearney said, now I got to do MTSS. Oh my gosh, one more thing. It should be integrated. And I really, we're talking about mental health, and that is my area and my background, but it's not separate really from academics and behavior. They're all intertwined. So that is a key piece here. Another primary component is using that data to drive differentiated instruction and to identify students in need of additional academic and non-academic supports. So effective MTSS implementation also requires schools to provide evidence-based intervention support to students experiencing difficulty. Additional benefits of MTSS include collaboration among teachers, general education, special education, support specialists, and community partners, and improved communication with caregivers about student progress and community resources. So here is our three-tiered model of the MTSS framework. As I mentioned, if you've seen anything about RTI or PBIS, you may have seen something very similar. It may have looked like a pyramid. We kind of have flipped it on its side. I like to think of this as an arrow pointing toward student outcomes. And this is the kind of traditional model, the one that we really use, where you have your universal, your targeted, and your intensive. So let's take a closer look at each. So the universal intervention and supports, it's also known as Tier 1 or primary prevention. It's designed for all students, and it occurs in the general education classroom, school-wide type supports. So examples of this would include universal screening, character education, teaching mental health literacy, and building school community. Now, the second tier is the targeted tier. This is often referred to as Tier 2 or secondary prevention, and it's designed for students who are experiencing difficulty with behavior and mental health. Targeted intervention can occur in many different settings, inside or outside the general education classroom. Typically, targeted intervention occurs in small groups with students who have very similar behavioral needs, mental health needs. One thing is the research shows us that even with an effective, well-planned, well-executed universal system of supports, interventions, only 80% are likely going to be achieving adequately with those. There's 10 to 20% of students are likely going to need more, and that's where the targeted comes in. Then at the next level, we can see our intensive supports, intensive intervention. This is also known as Tier 3 or tertiary prevention, and it's designed for the students who are not making adequate progress in Tier 2, or maybe students who have a really high intensity or frequency of behaviors and mental health needs, and they need that intensive support right away. Examples of this would include evidence-based individual or family counseling, a functional behavior assessment, FBA, and their behavior intervention plan, BIP, safety planning, intervention, and wraparound training. So, like we said, with targeted, even though if you have the best universal tier supports, the very best targeted tier supports, there's still likely going to be 1 to 5% of students who are going to need more supports. That's just what the research shows us. And one other thing that we really want to critically remind is that MTSS cannot be used to delay or deny an evaluation of a child suspected of having a disability and needing special education and related services. If you suspect the child may have a disability and needs these services, then you go ahead and go with the evaluation process. We don't use MTSS to delay. MTSS process, though, does help us with data and things like that, so that if you ever get to that point where you do think you need a referral, it'll also help you have the data and the supports that you need with that. So here we are again with our schoolhouse model of the multi-tiered system of support. So we've zoomed in a little bit, and you can see that we have these foundational features. Those are the ones that are on the steps. So the schoolhouse in the center of the picture represents the multi-tiered system of supports. And that outlines the structure of the school mental health system. It draws from a public health approach, and MTSS identifies that our services and supports are planned for the 3 tiers. 1 tier to provide universal supports to all students, 1 tier to intervene early and address emerging mental health concerns, and 1 tier to provide intensive or specialized services to support students with a mental health disorder. The MTSS is strengthened by the foundational features represented on the steps to the school. LEAs should consider how each of the foundational steps are addressed on a regular and ongoing basis to help advance the local comprehensive school mental health system. So as we continue to talk about MTSS and mental health, it's important that we correct some misconceptions. So here's a few observations and some things we want to provide some clarity on. A goal of Tier 1 is to reduce the need for Tier 2 and Tier 3 interventions and support. So all tiers are designed to be preventative and proactive, but you really need to have an emphasis on Tier 1. And I've seen this with some schools where they've identified so many students with need. You have 50, 60% of our students that need Tier 2. That's too much. Tier 2, it's targeted. It takes a lot of time and energy, and it's just not feasible or sustainable to try to do that with 60% of your students. So if you've identified a need, then that 60% of your students have, then that's where you really want to bolster the Tier 1. That needs to be the universal school-wide. And that can be impacted by where your community is. Some communities have certain needs they're a Tier 1 need. And so you focus on that, and then the students are still not responding adequately, you can provide better Tier 2 and Tier 3 interventions. The other thing too is that tiers are not student labels, they're levels of support. So you don't say, oh, our Tier 2 students, or oh, our Tier 3 students. It's like, no, you have students who are receiving Tier 2 or Tier 3. And we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a minute. Additionally, an integrated MTSS implementation, it's perpetually under construction. It's not a fixed system. It's a process that requires flexibility, a willingness to make mistakes, learn from them, and consistency. Do not expect automatic results. And this is where we'll talk more about why the team is important. So, we can't take this work lightly. It's very important. There is a sense of urgency, but it's a challenge because we can't rush it and we can't force it. So it's a real balance of it's urgent, it's important, and yet we also have to know it is a long-term process and it takes time. Student movement between tiers. So kind of as I mentioned, we don't label students as, oh, they're a Tier 2 student or they're a Tier 3 student. We want to think about these supports as supplements to that Tier 1. We mentioned how Tier 1 is really, really the most important because it's school-wide, it's focusing on all students. And then the Tier 2 and Tier 3 will provide supplements for students who are not adequately responding to that Tier 1. The other thing is, though, they don't replace Tier 1. So if a student is receiving Tier 2 support for behavior and mental health, they're still getting all the Tier 1 instruction and intervention. Same with Tier 3. And students don't necessarily move between the tiers in a linear manner. Like we mentioned earlier, if you might have a student with some high intensity needs, they need Tier 3 interventions right away. You don't have to, well, let's try Tier 2 first and see if that works. That just is delaying the student getting what they need. If it's apparent that they need intensive support, then that's what we'll provide. And some students may require supports from multiple tiers for different needs. So you may have students who are doing great academically in their math, and Tier 1 universal is what they need. They might be getting some extra support with their reading in Tier 2, and maybe they are also getting some support for mental health or behavioral needs in Tier 2. It just kind of depends, they can kind of fluctuate. So it's not a one size fits all, and it's not, oh, they're Tier 2 and they're Tier 2 for everything. It's really about the individual needs of that student. And the main goal too is that the students are participating in the least restrictive environment and getting as much time in that general education as possible. So there are some core features of mental health within MTSS that we want to talk about. A, we have effective teams that include community mental health providers. B, we have data-based decision-making that includes school data beyond office discipline referrals and community data. C, we have formal processes for the selection and implementation of evidence-based practices across tiers with team decision-making. D, we have early access to mental health support through comprehensive screening, including internalizing and externalizing needs. So internalizing would be needs that might not be so apparent. Their behaviors or mental health, they're very internal and you might see it. External are the type of behaviors or needs that they're more apparent. You can observe them more easily. Rigorous progress monitoring for fidelity and effectiveness of all interventions, regardless of who delivers them. Ongoing coaching at the systems and practices levels for schools and community professionals. So we want to optimize student mental health supports. And using MTSS can really help us establish a single system of delivery for supporting students' mental health needs. That's why I talked about, we don't want to have RTI over here and PBIS over here, and then, oh, we're doing an MTS over here. It should be really one single system. You know, it could be, we do think of, and we'll talk a little bit here more, but of how we think of RTI as a little more academic and PBS as a little more behavior, but they're really two arms on the same body, and that body is MTSS. And so in that single system of delivery, we want to have mental health specialists that are part of the school team. We want to have outside referrals processed through one team. And we also want to, when we're defining success, we don't want to just say access is enough. You can't just say, oh, you know what, we got that student connected with counseling services. Our job is done. They're fine. It's like, no, we define the success by the outcomes. Okay. Is that student's needs and goals being addressed? Are we monitoring? Is that counseling helping? Is that enough? Are there other things? We really look at rigorous progress monitoring is key to helping us monitor the outcomes. So the evolution of MTSS, excuse me. As I mentioned, we talk about RTI as being generally viewed as focusing on academics, right? And it includes uncovering strengths and needs and academic skills, using evidence-based curricula, explicit instruction, increasing the intensity of supports, and teams making decisions about what and how to implement support, you know, by grade level. And then, you know, we also have, probably a lot of you have heard of PBIS, right? Positive Behavior Intervention Supports. And that is often thought of when it comes to, you know, behavior and the social part and the emotional part. And this includes similar key aspects. There's a few key exceptions that are highlighted in bold. But again, we're uncovering strengths and needs in social, emotional, behavioral skills. We're using, we have the use of evidence-based curricula. We have explicit instruction as prevention. We're increasing intensity of supports, dose and frequency based on strength and need, and teams are making decisions about what and how to implement to support lead. So you can see some similarities and some differences there. But when we really bring it all together, here it is within MTSS. Because again, I am a firm believer that learning does not happen in a vacuum, and any of your academic learning is social. Anything you're learning academically is emotional. And if you're trying to engage students and trying to get them connected with your math curriculum, your history curriculum, well, you're also connecting them at an emotional level, at a social level. And so it really all does come together. And with that, we're going to kind of talk about teams and practices like that. And I'll hand the mic to Dr. Kearney.
Okay. So thank you, Dr. Barrett. So he just mentioned about having a single system of delivery. So how do we do that? So we talk about teaming practices, and we talk about how we start with teams and how you form teams on your campuses and your districts, right? So how do we do that? If schools have multiple teams that address mental health, behavior, academics, staff members can feel overloaded with meetings. Sometimes with multiple teams going on, we can be unaware of the potential overlaps of our efforts. Additionally, families, students, teachers, staff members can be confused about where to go, how to seek assistance, right? So if we're going to have one system of delivery, then we need to systematically integrate our teams. And that can improve the efficiency and reduce confusion and stress. Well, guess what? When we have the first task to align and integrate our personnel and stakeholders, we already have a process and a way to do that. And the first way to establish the system to integrate the teams comes from our handy dandy framework of MTSS that we already saw. And so the framework of MTSS came from Senate Bill 11 that was passed in 2019, and that stems from Texas Education Code 37. 1.115 that formed that Safe and Supportive Schools Programs team. Many of you know it as the SSSP team, which stated that we have to have a systematic and coordinated multi-tiered support system that address the school climate, social emotional domain, behavior, mental health, wellness, that also included collaboration with our community, county, state, organization. Now, that team also could conduct behavior threat assessments. It also looked at school safety, but ultimately, it was saying that we would have one team, right, that did that one single set of delivery. So this is not really something that's new. This is just what we're describing might sound different, but really it is what we're saying is that looking at that SSSP team. So you have in your handouts, TA is also provided for you in the Safe and Supportive School Program guidance, a way to look at it through school climate, that positive school climate. So you have it in your handouts to peruse later. So we know that schools can do this alone. And you certainly cannot address the enormity of mental health by yourself. And so out in our community, there are many child serving agencies that are also addressing the needs of student mental health. So for a minute, I want you to think about the resources in your community. Some are on the screen, and some of you are already working with many agencies in your surrounding school community and district areas. Can you think of some more agencies, some more personnel that you could possibly join your district and school team? And we are going to submit a poll. Thank you, Ashton. To think about now specifically personnel that you could add to your district community leadership team. And then you can just type in who you have already currently sitting on those teams from your community. So what we'll do, Ashton will have those and TA will have those. And so we will have a listing of the types of people you all are already using, the types of community members, the types of personnel you are already reaching out to. So TA will have that data. And so this is a huge resource for us to have, to say we can already reach out, right? And have this data. So thank you all for responding. Okay, whenever you're ready, Ashton, you can close the poll. So hopefully many of you had some of these members on your, or utilizing or inviting some of these members on your district community leadership team. So if not, you can include law enforcement, you're including some local mental health partners, some personnel from juvenile services, right? Some personnel maybe from after school programs, personnel from Department of Recreation Services, and think about why some of these community partners would be great voices to have on that district community leadership team. What kind of perspective they can offer as far as interventions, the kinds of supports, the kinds of prevention that they can offer to your schools when you're looking for resources for families, when you're looking for tiered prevention services, whether it's universal, targeted, or intensive supports that you might need for your students and families, right? So this is why we want to expand the way that we reach out and add members to that single source set of teams, right? An integrated leadership structure really should reflect the local context, right? So we should be expanding our view, because we'll talk in a minute about expanding data, but expanding our view beyond the context of the building, because we're trying to build on strengths. And the way that we build on strengths strengths, especially when we're talking about universal prevention and intervention, is to pull from the strengths of our community. So thank you for that activity. So, uh, in addition to pulling from the strengths, we talk about mental health services and the strengths of our clinicians, right? When we talk about the perspectives on our teams, sometimes we are including the voices of our clinicians when there is a crisis, right? Or when we are waiting for that tier 3 intervention. But we really should be including and integrating our teams, including people with expertise with behavior and mental health across all tiers. So utilizing our clinicians, including community and school-based, right? Social workers, counselors, psychologists, LSSPs at every tier. So at tier 1, utilizing our mental health providers for consultation, for coaching, right? Not just for providing services. Um, Mental health providers can support teachers, provide coaching, have consultation on behavior interventions, right? What can we do at targeted and tier 2 supports? Again, consultation, coordination. We can support those targeted groups, how to coordinate those groups, what kind of students would work best when we are trying to group students, right, for behavior and mental health. And then coaching and facilitation for those more intensive or individual kinds of services. So utilizing those voices, not just for those targeted individual services, but throughout all tiers, and not just from school-based clinicians, but pulling from our community-based clinicians to work with families, to work with our staff, right? Not just students, but providing tiered supports for staff as well. So, establishing school level procedures is a huge part of that team's duties, right? So we have team who's going to be looking at data. And in order to do that, we've got to have some procedures and routines. So at the district level, their job would be setting up procedures and protocols. At the campus level, their job would really be those routines. That is a critical part of strengthening implementation for MTSS, right? The district would establish the set of procedures, integrating, the coaches would guide and support those campuses in implementing these protocols. So specifically, schools would establish routines and procedures for, let's say, we're going to do universal screening, right? So campuses would say, well, this is what it's going to look like. This is how we're going to screen our students for mental health and behavior, right? This is what a request for assistance process is going to look like on our campus. This is how we are going to engage in database decision making. This is how we're going to say students are going to move and get assistance from tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3, right? These are the evidence-based interventions we are going to supply on our campus. And then the district would provide support with monitoring of fidelity. Are we doing what we say we're going to do, how it's supposed to be done? And then again, monitoring the outcomes. Are students getting what they need, and are they being supported and having the outcomes we want to see? So here is where schools are typically very good with using data to support academic interventions. But think about how we consider interventions for mental health, right? The use of data kind of varies. So I think back on when I was at a campus, and sometimes we would be sitting around a table and a student might have had several discipline referrals. And perhaps someone said, oh, maybe the student needs counseling. And everyone at the table agreed that the student could use counseling, right? And so the student got counseling. And that was kind of how a student was referred and received a service. So we are suggesting that in the era of MTSS and use of data, that we actually expand our use of data and do some progress monitoring. And we say, what is it about um, intervention, and how do we collect data to determine if counseling is really what the student needs, that we have a source of data that determine that that's really what the student needs. Now we're going to progress monitor to make sure that we are delivering that counseling in the way and doing counseling that the student actually needs. And then we're going to make sure that once the student meets the goal, that that student can then go down and be supported by maybe those universal interventions. So that's really, if you need a snapshot of MTSS for mental health, that's what it would look like in comparison to maybe 10, 15 years ago, right, for counseling. So how can we expand our view of data and how it can benefit MTSS for school mental health? So what types of community data are you using now to support your MTSS work for school mental health? So Ashton has put up another poll, and think about the data that you're using to support mental health. Again, you can type in whatever you're using. Again, this is great data that we can collect, TA can collect, and we can supply it for you if you guys want to know what people are currently using. And then we'll talk about how we can expand and what other kinds of data we can be collecting. So thank you for responding. Whenever you're ready to close, you can do that, Ashton. Thank you. Okay, so hopefully some of you had some of these things on your poll answers. So when we start thinking about adding families, youth, community agencies to our teams and to our collection of data, we get an expanded view of lives lived outside of school. You can see some of the community data we can review, because now we can start to customize our programming for the students and families we serve. So if we start looking at the demographic data of neighborhoods, of the community, the districts, we can also start looking at community strengths and partnerships, maybe some of the partnerships that families already have with community agencies that are serving as strengths, like agencies that families already lean on, that are already supporting them. And then we also can find out what are the homeless rates, right? What are incarceration rates? Other things like military deployment rates, if that is something in our community. I will give an example of the substance use rates because I was supporting a very small school community and the counselors, and they were ready to implement MTSS for mental health. Their campus, they had their team, their superintendent was supportive, they were ready, right? And their counselors came and said, we have a really significant problem with substance use on our campus. And we are sending a very high amount of students out for discipline alternative education placement, right, into the DAEP. And we know that's not working. Matter of fact, we know that several of our students are really addicted to vaping. Vaping was their issue. And we've reached out to substance abuse counselors. We have a social worker coming, and none of this has been effective. And we can't get support from our families, and we're struggling. So the social worker who was supporting them had reached out to law enforcement, and law enforcement had connected them to the health department. And so the health department came to one of the meetings that we were supporting them with and said, when we pulled up the data, the statistics showed that community, actually the whole community, had a really, really, really high substance use and addiction statistic. So the families were not supportive because the families were struggling themselves with substance use. So because we expanded and went outside of the school and found resources outside, we realized that this was a whole community issue and not just a school-based issue. Had the counselors not reached out for support, they would have just kept sending kids to the DAEP, right? And that would not have been effective for the kids or the campus. So when we expand our view of data and resources, then we can get some support for prevention and intervention. This slide, hopefully you can see it, but I'll read some of the community and school data. This just comes from a campus and a slide that we use in one of our trainings, but this is just an example of a campus and the types of data that they looked for. So for school, they used some climate surveys, youth risk assessment survey, school behavior data, attendance data, right? And then for community data, they went all out and used census data. They used community asset and wellness data. They looked at community health indicator. So these are just examples of things that you could use, data that already exist. So these are things that you don't have to collect if you want to know mental health, right, and wellness indicators in your community. So that's data that exists, but you don't have to go and collect. Now, if you want to find out what's happening on your campus and you want to do some assessment, there are three main forms of assessment that you could do for MTSS under the MTSS framework. And really, those are screening, progress monitoring, and diagnostics, right? So when you look at screening, that would be under the universal. Progress monitoring, you would do in all tiers, universal, targeted, and intensive. And really, diagnostics, you're only going to do in the intensive tier. So if you want to know, I'm not going to spend a lot of time today, but if you'd like to know more about assessment in MTSS, then you are more than welcome. TIER has a whole pathway about assessments in MTSS specifically for behavior. So we encourage you to come and join us. Universal screening. I'm going to touch a little bit on this, but again, we have a whole pathway designed for universal screening and progress monitoring specifically for behavior and mental health. So I would encourage you, because we talk a lot about universal screening, which I know for mental health sometimes is a bad word. But we would encourage you to explore universal screening. It can be a positive way to gain some great data, specifically because the purpose can be really to tell us who is at risk, right? And who we do not want to miss, children who might be struggling and who really could benefit from early intervention, right? I would rather intervene early than not catch a student who we could have intervened with and we just let go by and go by and go by, right? So sometimes catching students who may not need intervention by engaging in universal screening, which sometimes we don't want to do, may be a risk I'd be willing to take rather than missing children who might be struggling and we could have caught them, right? On the flip side, we can look at universal screening if we do it for looking for strengths, right? And build on those strengths if we're looking at social and emotional competencies. In our mass screening, we can show you how to do universal screening for strengths as well. So in mass screening, that could be teacher questionnaires We could look at internalizing or externalizing behavior. You could use a review of existing data. If you did not want to use a screener, you could just look at data for a small group of people, a small group of students. So there's lots of ways to do universal screening in behavior and mental health. Again, there's not just one way. You all are on a fabulous website. In order to get on this website, on this webinar today, which has the Texas Mental Health Toolkit, has some screening resources for you. In addition, the National Center for Intensive Interventions has some helpful resources through its tools chart for screening for academics and behavior. Again, the school-based screening tool compilation on the Texas School Mental Health Toolkit and the Center on Positive Behavior Interventions and Supports has a great systematic screening tool for universal behavior screeners. You have these in your handout as well. The highlight for considerations on assessments really is, if you're going to use assessments, are they reliable and valid, right? Is the assessment used for what its purpose and designed to do? Is it cost effective? Can you get the data from looking at data you already have? Do you really need to pay for using a screener if you already have the data, right? So sometimes we already know this about students without having to do a screener. So do what's most cost effective, I would say. And then, is the assessment directly related to the intervention? Sometimes we're gathering data on students and it's not even related to the interventions that we're trying to do, right? If our interventions are trauma based, right, we're trying to do trauma informed interventions and none of our data is related to trauma, then perhaps we should rethink the data collection that we're doing. Okay, so the last thing that a team needs to do is looking at our database decision making. So the team really has to look at that data and decide, what are we going to do with this? What kind of interventions are we going to put in place? And how do we determine how students are going to get support, right? How they are going to move throughout the tiers, how we are going to design our tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. So that is the job of the team. And the team has to decide this before we start moving students in and out of tiers, right? So we already have to have our partnerships with our community agencies. We already have to have MOUs established with our agencies. So we already have to talk with our community providers and partners to say, hey, we would like for you to come in and help our staff with tier 1 interventions for X, Y, and Z. Hey, can you come and support us with small groups for X, Y, and Z, right? Or can you support us with individual supports with X, Y, and Z? Based on maybe a pattern of data that you already have, right? You have to have that already established and set in place before you start placing students in and out. Because what happens if you wait and you say, oh, we have this many students who need this, we have this many students who need this, and now we've got to go and find our providers. What's going to happen then? Right? Then you're going to have students who are not going to get the help that they need. So the team's job is to be proactive. The team's job is to make decisions about evidence-based interventions ahead of time. And their job is to make decisions about how students are going to move in and out and the partnerships that are established before students are in need of these services. So the team can define and adopt the range of relevant data sources to guide their efforts. Okay. And again, the job of the team is to assess and set the entrance criteria and data thresholds for providing students with supports. So if we say, if we're going to use referral or discipline data, which is one piece of data, it shouldn't be the sole piece of data, but let's say we use discipline data. After 3 discipline referrals, we might have a meeting to discuss X, Y, and Z, and that would mean that we sit down with the teacher to look at some additional things, right? That would be an entrance criteria for a meeting, right? But we have to the team has to determine that before we start getting students getting discipline referrals, right? It can't be a on the fly, on the go thing. So that's what we mean by having processes and procedures in place through the MTSS framework ahead of time. So that is the goal and the job of the team. And finally, progress monitoring. So Dr. Barrett talked about this. And this is a big piece of what I think mental health, this is new for us in the mental health world. Academics has pretty much been doing this for a while, but for us, this is new. So this is how monitoring the outcomes. So this would be, I've been in counseling, I have a goal, and now how am I progressing? Right. And if I have met the goal, then I no longer need counseling. And then whatever I was working on, let's say I was working on anger management and I've met the goal with my counselor. Now I go back to my classroom and I'm supported. That anger management goal is now supported in the classroom with tier 1 interventions, right? It doesn't mean that I might not be struggling with anger management. It just means that that anger management is now monitored with tier 1 interventions back in the classroom. So this is a little bit different from how we maybe used to be managing mental health supports. So progress monitoring means I continue to monitor the student and whatever support I needed throughout the tiers, right? And we continue to track the progress of students who are struggling with a specific intervention. So we don't keep them in the intervention the whole year, right? So they don't stay in counseling all year unless they need to. But the data can reflect that they require that particular intervention, and the team is meeting on a consistent basis with data reflects that they require that intervention for as long as they are in that intervention. So all of that we can expound on and reflect on, and with much more support and training. If you want to learn more, we've got more for you. But overall, mental health, we know, is everyone's job. We need to build on the capacity of the entire staff. We know you're doing hard work, and Dr. Barrett is going to talk about more great things and more examples of best practices that you can continue this work.
Thank you, Dr. Kearney. I'll go ahead and share my screen. Got to get caught up. So I do like that segue of moving from the idea of a few staff members are responsible to it being everyone's job. I just, like you were talking about, kind of the way we did things 10, 15 years ago, when I was a school counselor, we had 800 students and we had 2 counselors. And typically the way our model was, one counselor did all the scheduling and enrollment and transition to high school and transition from elementary. And the other counselor was the counselor, which was me. And so, I took on the guidance curriculums, I did Red Ribbon Week and college week and things like that, but also would, talk to the students, do peer mediations, things like that. But, there was a lot of students. And so it couldn't just be, oh, go see Dr. Barrett, go see Dr. Barrett. Like I couldn't be the one person to meet the needs of the 800 students. We needed it to be a collaborative, whole wide team effort. And so we're going to look at some of those best practices for supporting student mental health more systemically versus just putting it on the shoulders of a few people, a few experts in the school. One of the most impactful ways that the research shows that we can do this is with creating a school environment in which mutually supportive relationships among students, teachers, and parents can develop. Student success is greatest when teachers, students, and parents collectively work together. So this is a big first step. If you have a positive school climate and culture that fosters what we just read here, that creates this inclusive, supportive school environment for students, that is the first step. And that is something that is everybody's job. And one thing too, I think it's clear, and a lot of research shows and survey shows, teachers don't feel as comfortable. They don't feel like they have the right training or things to get into mental health needs. And we're not asking another teacher like, oh, you're a history teacher, you're an expert in your content, and now you also have to be a therapist. That is not the case at all. But every one of us in the school can do things that are therapeutic, right? Even as a school counselor in the school, I wasn't providing therapy. I do have my LPC. I'm a licensed professional counselor, but in the school setting, I'm not providing therapy. I am just doing things that are therapeutic. And so, that is the thing with a lot of this focus, and a lot of what we're going to talk about in this section is it really starts with the adults and what can we do, support the adults, bolster the adults, and what can the adults do to help create this positive climate and culture. PBIS is a very important piece of creating school climate and culture. The PBIS framework, it's a multi-tiered system of support, and it's designed to prevent problem behavior by creating predictable environments that include common language and practices throughout the school. The expectations and pro-social behaviors are explicitly taught and reinforced, just as we teach and practice academic skills and knowledge. At the heart of PBIS is the idea that students can learn positive behavior. This learning happens when we create predictable environments, right? A predictable environment helps create a sense of safety. You know what to expect. You know what's coming. To create environments that support teaching and reinforce positive behaviors, educator behavior must change. Navigating this change requires a system of supports for both students and educators. Within PBIS, there's a strong emphasis on supporting and fostering positive relationships between educators and students. We're going to look at this in a moment after we examine PBIS. But again, that relationship, that went back to our parent story, right? The teachers there built a relationship with that student. And that was a key with turning around the success, turning around the failures that student was experiencing into successes. So PBIS, again, is always, I think, important to kind of define things, right? One of the things about PBIS is having common language. So let's have a common language about PBIS, right? So within an MTSS framework, PBIS helps districts and schools support students' academic, social, and behavioral success. It is defined as an evidence-based, multi-tiered framework that helps districts and schools organize and implement effective social and behavioral practices that support academic achievement for all students, especially students with disabilities. Now, what is PBIS not? Sometimes it's good to define something by what it isn't. It's not a program, it's not a curriculum, it's not a one-time training. PBS is not just putting a bunch of posters up in the hallway and throwing out some rewards periodically and feeling like you're doing PBIS. It is not that at all. It is very systemic, it is very intentional, and it is continuously looking at data for improvement. So PBIS, in essence, is an instructional approach, right? Discipline comes from the same Latin word that means to learn, to teach. And so PBIS is about teaching behavior. So within this framework, we have an emphasis placed on preventing problem behavior by creating predictable environments that include common language and practices throughout the school. Expectations and pro-social behaviors are explicitly taught and reinforced, just like when we teach and practice academic skills and languages. And that's where we won't get into it as much in this, but we do have some trainings if you really want to dive into the PBIS, and where at the universal level, you're teaching the expectations. And then sometimes when the students aren't really succeeding, you have some targeted supports that are just reteaching and re-emphasizing and giving students a chance to practice and learn how to engage in those expected behaviors. It also gets into what things look like in different settings. What are these expectations and behaviors look like in the library? What do they look like in the cafeteria? What do they look like in the hallways? What do they look like in the classroom? It's a very well thought out and systemic process. So again, we're re-emphasizing here that this is about students can learn positive behavior. We have to teach it. We can't just expect students to come in and just know what to do. The school environment is a thing, and we want to create that environment where we can teach and reinforce these behaviors. You know, one of the things that I like to do when I was a teacher in my classroom, I talked about like, well, in here, this is what we do. And you know, everybody's coming from different places, and some behaviors are acceptable in different settings, from different families, from different places, you know, but in here, like, this is what we do in here, right? And this is how we're expected in here. And you kind of create that environment to reinforce that. And we also know that if we're going to change those environments, then that has to change the educator behavior, right? And so when we create these systems of support, we're supporting not just the students, but we're also supporting the educators, the adults in the building. So this is another visual of kind of what we talk about with that PBIS framework, right? We talked kind of a little bit about an umbrella before, but what you have in these elements is you have proactive preventative design. You have common language, and it is also adaptable to fit the context and needs, right? So we can kind of think about how this umbrella encompasses many initiatives, strategies, programs that improve behavioral academic outcomes for students, many of which are probably already in place. There's already a lot of good things happening. And so we don't want to, again, not pile on more, but like, what are we doing already? What can we expand? What can we build on? And so we have this framework because it's not a curriculum, right? But we have this framework, this umbrella that can house and oversee all the things that we're doing in that way. And then we have, again, the 3 tiers, right? We have the universal interventions, we have the targeted interventions, and we have the intensive interventions. In a school that implements PBIS with fidelity, these initiatives and strategies are never used in isolation, but instead are consistently tied back to the larger framework. All behavioral strategies relate back to the school-wide expectations, creating a common language and positive school culture. The common language and the strategies used to teach and promote the language can be used to support every student, including those who have disabilities or struggle with skill deficits. A lot of this, when we're talking about, you know, the integrating of the positive school climate and culture and creating this framework, you know, it's the predictable environment, things like that. It's also about building relationships and having a sense of belonging. So students know what is expected of them and feel like they belong. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. Well, one of the things too that we have a framework designed for is what is called the interconnected systems framework. So once PBIS is firmly established, districts and schools can use this interconnected systems framework, is also known as ISF, as an implementation framework that creates and guides the deliberate merger of education and mental health systems and staff members. So ISF was developed because despite the strengths of PBIS and school mental health, school and community systems continued to struggle to meet the mental health needs of children and adolescents, and schools often lacked a comprehensive universal approach to support mental health in children and youth. So ISF draws on the strengths while addressing the limitations of PBIS and school mental health through strategic linkage of the student mental health practices within the framework of PBIS. This produces a single system of delivery for behavior and mental health supports. Remember, we talked about that single system of delivery earlier. This results in an integrated structure and process for education and mental health leaders to interact more effectively and efficiently. So again, I don't want to feel like we're just throwing more things at you, but if you have your PBIS system firmly in place, we have some really great trainings, and there's other places that have it too. But the ISF, it can go really step by step. So I remember seeing some questions in the chat of like, where can I find community data and where can I get behavioral screenings? The interconnected systems framework has what they call installation guides. And so at the district level, there are, I think, like 5 steps to install ISF at the district level. But don't let that fool you. Those 5 steps, each one of them has like 5 steps within themselves, and each step is very detailed, and it's a commitment to go through. But once you have the basics in place of a good PBIS and you've got your good mental health supports going, if you really want to take it to that next level, ISF can really help you do that. And I've alluded to this a little bit too, but I think really one of the things that we don't want to forget, we don't want to lose sight of when we're looking at data and we're looking at systems and frameworks is, it really comes down to relationships, right? All learning is really about relationships. Learning does not happen in a vacuum, right? New learning is gained and reinforced from teacher to student, student to teacher, student to student, and like student, old knowledge with new knowledge. It's all about relationships and connection, right? Human connection, knowledge connection, and building relationships with students can create that positive support for learning and growth. Such relationships must be intentionally developed and nurtured. And then, I'm not just saying this. Right here on this slide, we show that the research demonstrates that teacher-student relationships have a strong impact on educational outcomes, right? I mean, you could talk about reducing your discipline problems by 31%. That's huge. And a lot of that comes from having those strong relationships. And that sense of belonging is another big piece that can really help create a mental health support for children. If they're coming from disadvantaged economic backgrounds, they have learning difficulties, if they're highly mobile, things like that. Creating a sense of belonging is a human need that we all need and that students need, and it can really help bolster their academic achievement, their mental health success, their behavior achievement, things like that. So, positive relationships, they're a foundation for student success. They're not sufficient to improve student outcomes, but they are a huge piece of the puzzle. So speaking of the relationship building, we also want to engage the family, right? All caregivers and families want their children to succeed. Families who are informed and involved in this work are more likely to support it. And we need to work from a culturally responsive lens to build on caregiver strengths to support their children's needs. We want to collect family data to and family input to ensure that the system supports and expectations for students at school are culturally relevant and meaningful to the families. We want to use various channels of communication to share information, such as school-wide expectations, mental health strategies that are effective at school and might also benefit families at home. And we want to capitalize on some of those existing formal and informal events, such as family nights. Some caregivers have had traumatic experiences with schools, authority figures, etc. So trauma-informed practices can facilitate family engagement. And if you liked any of those little bullets, we also have trainings on that, on how to partner with families when you're implementing PBAS. We have trainings on creating trauma-sensitive school. So part of this, I said, is in a short 70 minutes with a big broad topic. Some of it is just trying to kind of help get you hooked to learn more and get you connected to where you can learn more. Similarly, not only do we want to engage with the family, we want to engage with the community. To fully support student mental health, schools must engage at this level, right? We want to engage social service agencies to connect with families through schools to build trust and interaction. We want families to receive information and training regarding mental health and wellness. Families and community partners promote social, behavioral, and well-being skills for children. And to implement MTSS effectively, we must formalize those institutional relationships within the community. They can't just be relied upon those personal relationships like, oh, hey, I know somebody, I made this. It's got to be formal. We need to keep that because that's got to be sustainable. So information about creating memoranda of understanding with community partners can be found in the interconnected systems framework pathways. Again, there's more really detailed things to get to that granular level in those ISF trainings. We're really kind of 30,000 feet right now. But we do want to get your hands on resources for implementation. So we do have online self-paced courses that TIER offers. You can find that on the Texas SPED support website. We have community resources listed in our handout. I know people have been asking about the handout. I think Ashton linked it, but you're also going to get it when this is over. We've got the resources specific to Texas educators, and we have some mental health needs assessment resources there too. And as we highlight here too, we have a really nice trauma-informed training series from Project Restore. So a lot of really great work is happening across the state. We just want to make sure you're staying connected with that. So we're kind of coming up toward the end of this piece, and we want to kind of close out with this here. And so we have a quick poll as we talk about self-care. What are some ways that your school or district promote self-care and mental health? We'll give you a little bit of time to answer that. And as you're answering it, I'll talk a little bit about how we can promote self-care at the individual level, which is prioritizing your mental health, right? It's kind of like when you're on the plane and they tell the parent you got to put your mask on before you put the mask on the kid. Like as the adults, we've got to be taking care of ourselves if we're going to be able to take care of our students and our colleagues. We have to build our own resiliency. We can't teach what we don't know. So we have to teach, we have to model, we have to reinforce. And going back again to that parent story, one of the reasons that school was so successful was the emphasis on the training and on continuous learning and continuous improving. So yeah, please feel free to share and we'll look at that if there's any ways that your school or district are promoting self-care and mental health, especially even for the adults, you know. At the school and district level, you could emphasize the mental health and wellness of all adults. You could conduct needs assessments, provide that training, support, ongoing professional development, opportunities to foster personal well-being, you know. So if you're at that leadership level, like what are you doing to help take care of the staff? You know, those types of things too, when it comes to this, that's going to help those senses of belonging, taking care of the self. That leads to higher teacher retention rates, which we know is a really important thing right now. You know, we want to keep, it's a tough job, and trying to keep those teachers connected and keeping them supported so that they can do this really important and challenging work. So that's just what we're going to kind of end on here, is that, you know, we're shifting to this whole school approach for supporting student mental health. It's not like what we've been doing 10, 15 years ago, like Dr. Kearney mentioned. And, you know, if we're going to begin to build that capacity, the initial unit of change is the individual. So for all adults in the school to be fully responsive to student needs, and those of families, individuals must prioritize their own mental health and well-being. Like we said, it's everyone's job. We're all in this together. So let's take care of one another. Okay, so that kind of concludes things for us, Ashton.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much, Dr. Baird and Dr. Kearney. It sounds like from the chat, folks have learned a lot. We are going to have a little bit of a Q&A really quickly. One quick reminder, though, is we would really appreciate if you all could complete our poll survey. I just put it in the chat. We'll do our Q&A because I don't want to limit our time on that. But so as we kind of had this conversation, please remember to complete the poll survey. So Tammy does have a few Q&As that she has, or a few questions that she's checked out in the Q&A function. But before we get started with that, I did want to ask you all a quick question, especially Dr. Baird and Dr. Kearney. You all mentioned a little bit about, right, you know, we kind of touched the tip of the iceberg with this session. Like there's a lot more resources that TIER has to offer, whether it be online or even some of the more intensive technical assistance out there in the ESC region. So I just wanted to see if y'all could take just a couple of minutes to describe a little bit about the resources that you all have that LEAs or even campuses could connect with, and then also how they can get those resources for technical assistance.
Yeah, no, that's great. So we work with every regional service center. We have certified trainers in this content, and lots of content across all the ESCs, and also many of LEAs have participated and trained with us. So that would be our biggest recommendation, is to connect with your regional service center. They can provide training, they can provide coaching, they can provide additional support. That would be the best way. And you can, if you're not familiar with the Texas Sped Support website, you know, there's contact information on there where you can search, and you can search MTSS, and then you can find the representative. But, you know, I know the regional service centers are very responsive. So if you just reach out to them, that would be the first thing. And then, you know, as we mentioned, you can also find through that Texas Sped Support website links to, we have some online classes if you want to continue your learning. We have some course on PBIS, partnering with families with PBIS, and other tier created MTSS trainings. So that would be, but we do hope this is not a one and done. We do hope, I mean, I've seen some names that are pretty familiar, and I hope that these names become familiar, because this is a very much a collaborative effort. Dr. Kearney, do you have anything to add?
No, and you know, you can always reach out We can also provide, if you want, I saw a lot of people had some questions about particular things. You can always reach out through that Texas Sped Support website for if you have specific questions to one of our tier members, and we'll always chat with you as well.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. I know there is a strong appetite out here in the state to really get a grasp on MTSS, especially as it relates to implementing that school mental health piece, right? So definitely appreciate you all for sharing how to get access to that TA provided. I'll pass it over to my colleague Tammy now. I know we have some really thoughtful questions in the Q&A function, and I'm gonna give us a couple of minutes to just share those questions out and see if y'all have some answers to them.
So thank you, Ashton. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of combine these questions. So the first question has to do with universal screeners. Can you talk a little bit more about, let's say a district or a campus is interested in universal screening? Is there any information or resource that you could provide or think of that would help them along that universal screening process? So going from choosing the right universal screener for their district all the way to what processes are given. I know they were asked, specific questions about consent, et cetera, but is there any like a good resource that you would recommend to our audience?
So those three websites on the handout, that systematic tool, that really walks you through, are you ready for a screener? Should you be using a screener? Really those are the questions you should be asking first before you start looking for a screener, because not everyone needs to be doing a screener. So before you start searching, you really have to start determining whether or not screeners are good for you. So going through that process first, and then utilizing those websites on identifying based on your data, based on your population, walking through those websites will help you walk through that process. But essentially, what we talked about today, establishing an MTSS, you have to have your framework first. So universal screening is part of the framework, right? It's not something you would do in isolation. So if you don't have your framework established, I would suggest not even starting down the pathway for universal screening. But all of those websites and resources will give you what you need in order to go down the process for universal screening.
Yeah,
Yeah,
because piggyback off what Dr. Kearney's saying, like if you screen and then you've identified students, but you don't have a plan for what to do with those students, then you've just kind of wasted time. So like if you're going to screen, you better be prepared to address the needs of the students you've identified.
Great points. Thank you so much for that. Someone also asked about data collection system. And so in a broader sense, can you talk a little bit more about as a campus or a district are looking at, their MTSS systems as it relates to mental health? What are things that they should be looking for in a data system? And, are there any resources that they could use as they set that up?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times when we're looking at data for behavior and mental health, we typically look at some of those beginning, the ABCs, they're called. You have your attendance, your behavior, and which is usually measured by like office discipline referrals, or if there's other sort of referral systems in there. And then the C is has to do with like course grades, how they're doing. So, those ABCs, they're also part of what are known as early warning indicator systems. So if you ever want to look up early warning indicator systems, Johns Hopkins has a lot of really great information about building that. So, if you're noticing problems with attendance, that's an area that's like a red flag, what's going on. A lot of discipline referrals, what's going on there. They're not succeeding academically, what's going on there. The nurse is another really great source, and so because she sees students a lot and you can find trends if they're going to the nurse at a certain time of day or things like that, what's going on. But again, a lot of our pathways too have things with like you can build a referral system, right? That's why you have those teams. So you're not just kind of anecdotally talking, but you want to capture, you're looking at your early warning indicator data. Those are ways. But then you can also have like a referral system. that teachers can refer. Hey, I'm kind of concerned about about the student, what's going on. And kind of again with the data, it's not outside the relationship too. If a teacher has a good relationship with the kids, they notice when maybe things are not quite right, something's different, because sometimes the harder thing to capture are those internalizing behaviors. And so some of those, again, some of those screeners can be ways to capture some of those. But if you've got this PBAS system and things like that too, and you're doing, say, surveys and needs assessments, and you're kind of getting feedback, family input, family input is some really great qualitative data. They can let you know some things that are going on. And if they feel engaged, then you're getting bigger picture and finding out what's going on. But yeah, there's some great resources to build that, kind of comprehensive data system, and you want to pull multiple sources. So again, that's kind of a 30,000-foot level. I mean, we could do a whole training on just the data piece, but hopefully that kind of answers.
Definitely. Thank you. Well, let me ask you both this. So let's say I'm an administrator, I'm a classroom teacher. I've heard all this great, amazing things. I know that my campus and district aren't quite there with, the mental health systems and supports for students, but I am fired up and I want to go back to my campus and district and I want to start having these conversations. What's some advice that you have to those for us as next steps after this webinar?
Well, I do really think it starts with that whole school climate and culture, and kind of examining and looking at what strengths you have, what is going on, the needs assessments, looking at yourself. I'm a firm believer that the principal sets the tone in the school. So if you're in that role, you have a huge influence of the tone. But everyone is really involved in this. I mean, the teachers and the way they're interacting with students. I mean, some of it comes really simple. We have expectations that have to be enforced. If we don't enforce it, we endorse it. But how are you? Is the first thing when a student walks to your classroom, are you criticizing them because they forgot their belt today, or their shirt's untucked, or they're out of, or are they're late? Are you kind of like, is that first impact just a really negative, like getting on them, or do they feel welcome and, hey, it's good to see you. Oh, and by the way, let's get that shirt tucked in, or I noticed you're a little bit late, So I think that is a really kind of starting standpoint, just from a really easy level of like, what's that relationship and how are you treating one another? But again, it's like, it's really got to be all in. And it's like, are your custodians, how are they interacting, their influence, your cafeteria staff, your maintenance staff? I mean, it's really, really a group effort. And I was at a training this week with a principal who's turned around schools in California, a lot of work, and they would do an annual event, actually twice a year, a state of the school, and they were looking at the data, but it built up and it was positive, and they were celebrating their wins and any little bit of win. And she was at the lowest performing school in the entire area of Long Beach, and she moved it up to be one of the highest performing in just a couple years. But it was really getting everybody together and examining what you have, what you need, and she was all about celebrating every little success you have, every little win, and bringing that together with where people feel, the families felt welcome, people felt welcome, and you kind of create that. And then like Dr. Kearney said, you got to have that MTSS system in place. When you're building that system and you're building those relationships, you'll just keep going, because it's a process. It's urgent, it's important, and it can't happen overnight. So that's tough. So we got to keep each other motivated.
Definitely. Thank you so much. So I really appreciate you, Dr. Barrett and Dr. Kearney, for joining us today and giving us this amazing information. There's a couple things we need to do to kind of wind up this webinar. Hopefully you'll see on the screen, I've kind of posted a little bit early, but there is our post survey for this session. It only takes about like